Just make sure I've got my screens arranged the way I like them.
Sure.
Gonna have the paper open over here.
Me too.
I've got my questions down here. I've got you guys over here. Camera up there. Well, hello and welcome to this episode of the Academy of Management Review Origins series, where we ask the question, where does theory come from? I'm your host, Rich McAdock. I'm an associate editor at AMR, and I'm also professor of management at Purdue University's Krannert School of Management. My guests today are Alex Murray, Jen Reimer, and David Sirmon, who will be talking with me about their paper called Humans and Technology, Forms of Conjoined Agency in Organizations, which is forthcoming in AMR. So first of all, welcome to the Origin series and congratulations on your paper being accepted at AMR.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So let me just, so I was reading this paper while I was exercising earlier today, and I think I understand maybe about the first half of this paper, maybe not so much about the second half of the paper. So let me start by checking in my understanding of the first half of the paper with you, and you guys can correct me if you think I'm not getting something, and then maybe I'll ask you to explain the second half of the paper. So my understanding is that you're looking at technology-based artificial agents and how incorporating them into organizational routines can affect various aspects of the routines. And you basically break down routines into two components. You have selecting actions, and what was the other one?
Developing protocols. Developing
protocols, sorry, it wasn't on the tip of my tongue, right? So developing protocols and selecting actions. And you make the point that an artificial agent can be involved in either of those activities or both. And you distinguish different technologies according to whether an artificial agent is involved in one or the other or both of those, right? And I think you call technologies that are involved in neither, you just call those assisting technologies. Technologies that are involved in both, you call those automating technologies. I get those two labels. It's kind of the two off diagonal labels I had a little bit of confusion over, right? So the one was arresting technologies, which is technologies where the artificial agent is involved in selecting actions, but not in developing protocols. And then you have augmenting technologies, which is the reverse, where the artificial agent is involved in developing protocols, but not in selecting actions. So I was a little bit just, I understand the assisting versus automating label. That makes sense. Arresting and augmenting, help me understand why you chose those labels.
Sure, I'd be happy to take this one. So arresting technologies, which effectively are distributed ledger technologies, and particularly the smart contracts that are built on top of a distributed ledger. So this is blockchain, just think about it that way. And essentially they require a consensus of actors to put in place, develop the protocols and put them in place. And then the technology just automatically implements it. So it's selecting the action based on inputs in the environment. So, there's a number of things that can occur that are then baked into those protocols, and then it automatically implements an action within the organization. So that's what we mean by arresting, because it doesn't allow the human actor to select something that may be different than what is embedded into those protocols.
I was wondering what was arresting about it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So humans don't have the ability. They would need to revise the protocols themselves, which would require consensus from a host of actors.
Okay. Okay. That's why it's called arresting. Okay. And then augmenting, that was the reverse, where
that's the reverse.
Yeah. So tell me about augmenting. Why do you use label augmenting there?
Yeah, so that's also a good question. So effectively, so these are what we're seeing, a lot of times in courtrooms and in predictive policing. So you have a technology that's, a structured machine learning algorithm, if you will, that can take data, can analyze that data, and can spit out a recommendation. So it's, still putting that out there. It's developing the logic by which a recommendation is made. At the end of the day, whether it's the police department or the judge in the courtroom, they are still selecting the action. They're selecting where the police should go. They're selecting what is the verdict in this courtroom. So in those cases, whereas the technology does, draw upon its own protocols to put forth a suggestion, it's still the imperative of the human to select the action that will actually be executed.
Okay, so it augments the decision process, but doesn't make the decision, right?
Precisely.
Okay, good. So then okay, so I think that's roughly the first half of the paper that I do understand. But let me also pause here to say you coined this term conjoined agency. What does that term mean?
So when we were developing this paper, a lot of sort of what kept coming up was this interaction between humans and technology, right? So it's not that one is acting independently of the other, or it's not even that it's sequential and like one is acting and then the other is acting, but really they have this sort of joint authority or joint sort of agency and working through sort of how a decision is made through the whole process of developing the protocol and selecting. So we really wanted to get across this idea that it is intermixed and it's not fully separable into humans and technology doing these sort of distinct things, but that they're working together through this process to come up with the routine.
Okay, so then you take these four types of technologies and you make predictions about their impact, or maybe the differences between their impacts on the amount of routine change, the amount of change to a routine, the predictability of the change to the routine, and what was the third criterion?
Responsiveness.
The responsiveness. Thank you. Yeah, I knew I was on the tip of my tongue, right? So the degree of change, the predictability of change, and the responsiveness of the routine. So walk me through the logic of how you get from those four types of technologies to your predictions about those three outcome variables.
So it's a good question. And so I think taking a step back, a debate in the routines literature has been routines are both a source of stability, right? It allows an organization to continually enact a certain process, but they're also a source of dynamic change, right? So a routine needs to be flexible to allow an organization to continually be competitive in the environment. So in that sense, there is a degree of change that occurs with a routine inevitably or inherently. And that is why we looked at, the degree of change and the predictability of that change at a particular moment in time. So that's the key there, is it's actually at each action. So at each time the routine is executed, it may change. And can actors, say, people in positions of power or control within the organization, can they predict how that routine is going to change with each enactment of it? And then responsiveness is actually the degree of change or the longitudinal amount of change and how responsive the routine is to different inputs over time that allow it to evolve. So that's kind of the distinction between predictability and degree of change versus responsiveness. And then it actually came down then to, okay, how is each technology, how is each form of conjoined agency influencing these various outputs or outcomes? And taking the baseline of humans in assisting technologies is important here, because all of the other propositions were in comparison to that baseline. So this is humans working with Excel spreadsheets, humans working on an assembly line with various technologies that allow them to perform the routine, but they're not necessarily arresting their ability, augmenting it, or automating the routine fully as the other technologies may be doing that we theorize on. So that's the baseline. And then compared to that baseline, we talk about the impact of humans in arresting technologies. So effectively, when humans are working with arresting technologies, the degree of change is going to be less because than if it's assisting, because that consensus is required to change the protocol. So it's going to continually be acted out. When it's augmented, that is going to be slightly more than it is when under assisting technologies, and automating will be to a much greater degree than with assisting technologies, just because it's able to take inputs from the environment in real time, act upon those, and change the routine as necessary based on whatever environmental conditions are in place.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, go on.
Sir, yeah. So no questions around degree. Anyone else want to chime in on degree before we talk about predictability?
You're rolling, Alex.
You're on a roll.
Right, cool.
We love it.
Sweet. All right, let's keep going. So then predictability of routine change. So once again, this is each enactment of the routine. Can people within the organization predict, okay, this is what it's going to look like under these criteria at this point in time? So with assisting technologies, pretty straightforward what's going to happen, right? This is our baseline. This is an assembly line. Think Nelson in the winter, everything's in place. Things are just being churned through again, and again. Now, when you have arresting technologies, since once again, that consensus is required to change those protocols, and they're not selecting actions, excuse me, they are selecting actions, but they're selecting those actions based on the protocols that are in place. It's continuous, and that predictability is greater than if humans are able to, be lax in their application of the routine, if they are able to, change the routine based on what the humans don't have that capacity when arresting technologies are in place. Therefore, the predictability is greater. When you have an augmenting technology, humans are still able to utilize their own, biases, heuristics. They just have another data point by which to that they can consider, that being the output of the augmenting technology. So therefore, the predictability is going to decrease when compared with assisting technologies. This is that one more kind of voice at the table that may cause the routine to change, that voice being that of the technology, the structured machine learning algorithm. And then finally, with automating technologies, it greatly decreases the predictability, because once again, they can draw on anything in the environment at any point in time and make decisions that may not be optimal, but based on whatever logic they've internally developed, it is what they view as optimal. And a human actually doesn't have the ability to come in and say, no, like there is a different action that may be more advantageous here. And in those cases, the predictability goes down.
Right, and that's one of the the kind of the double-edged sword of machine learning technology is it can make great decisions for you, but you just don't know why it's making those decisions. It's a bit of a black box in terms of what criteria is it really hooking onto here.
Absolutely. What are the optimization functions, and what has it chosen to optimize?
Right.
And in extreme cases, the technology can actually determine not only what the optimization functions are, but what it is optimizing.
Okay. So it can change its own objective function. Got it. Okay. So that's a great summary of the paper. So who would you say is the target audience for this paper? Who should read it?
Great question. And I think there's a lot of different audiences that can benefit from this paper. So if you go back into the history of how this idea developed, it wasn't focused on routines specifically as we developed this idea, because this idea was messy and over through the review process and iterations with colleagues, it's refined. But even your earlier questions indicate different audiences are going to have different preconceived or any exposure to some of these ideas, either the routines literature or the different types of technology or the consideration of this interface between human agent, technological agent. And so I think the paper adds value to a lot of different audiences. To the routines literature, that's where we embedded and framed the technology interface specifically. And to that literature, we make contributions. And the review process, there were different opinions there shared by people that were experts in routines. For people that are interested into technologies, those that are highly involved already, as well as those that would be more novice in their exposure to more advanced technologies, and not advanced in terms of faster tools, but advanced in terms of having some properties agentic ability. And from there, I think the paper speaks to a fairly easily followed categorization of these technologies and separates them in ways that when I'm listening to symposiums and other academic speaking, they sometimes blur across what these categories are to us. And that adds a significant amount of confusion to the audience and to the presenter. So simply categorizing these, contrasting them to what we would consider what we call assisting, but just some typical tools that speed up but have no agentic properties, at least from many people's point of view, they don't have agentic properties. So, and lastly, I think you have an audience that is really concerned more generally about change in organizations. We speak to routines, but it's not limited to routines. This is an effective first cut of what might be important, but in our discussion section and with creativity, people can consider a lot of different applications for technology, shared agency, and what that means to organizations more fully across governance and venture capital, and I mean, a slew of other phenomena. So I think there's actually three audiences: a general reader who's interested in organizations, a person that has interest in technology from different perspectives, very explicit or novice to it, and those that have interest in routines. And when we weren't trying to be all things to all people, it's just that this particular paper, this particular theoretical treatment of the phenomena, I think plays across numerous audiences.
Right. You mentioned the way that this typology helps clarify, some of the distinctions between technologies that would otherwise be blurred together. And I did find that very useful aspect of the paper. And it was very clear, so even I could follow it, even though I'm not, involved in this literature at all. So kudos for that. So we do call this the origin series for a reason, and it's because we try to get to the origin of theoretical contributions. Where does theory come from, to help our readers and potential authors to demystify the theory development process. So tell us a little bit about how did this project get started in the first place? Where did you get the idea for this?
Sure, so I can start a little bit. So this was actually a project that had a very, very long sort of development cycle. I think we all went to the same seminar. There was actually a guest speaker at University of Washington from another department. So they were in the finance department. They came to speak about blockchain and sort of various applications. And we all wound up attending this seminar and just it really striking a chord and there being a lot of thought around how this would impact sort of organizational theory, management literature. And at the time, a lot of people were thinking about ICOs. But the three of us who we hadn't really worked together too much before, we were really drawn to the fact that there was something sort of deeper, like a bigger, more fundamental story. And so we just started meeting and we started talking. And that went on really, I think, for a couple years before this manuscript really took a shape that resembles what it is today. And an interesting story, so we presented this at an AOM symposium, maybe a year and a half into our conversation. And at that point, we really saw we were taking on this huge picture, huge sort of task. And that's where actually what started as our original project and looking at how these various technologies are impacting different things in organizations started to split apart. And we started to see okay, this is multiple papers, this is multiple things. And this manuscript sort of became the first slice that we took of that.
That's great. So during those first 2 years of conversations, can you give us maybe a sense of what were the issues that you were wrestling with during that time, right? What were as you were trying to frame this and put boundaries around it, what were the things that you had to say, okay, I'm cutting it off here and this goes outside to another paper and this is kept here, and give us some flavor of what those discussions were like.
Yeah, so I think, even in the first year, it's generous to say we had something to frame or put boundaries around. It really was us sitting down, which has been an inherent interest in how could this be used in an organization? Could it affect coordination? Could it affect how rules are developed? What about governance? They were just honestly I just remember the whiteboard just being covered in questions that were very sometimes theoretical, but also sometimes just grounded in organizational phenomena and this back and forth.
Right.
And I think Jen was actually pretty spot on. It really was that presentation, which was part of a symposium at AOM. So it was a short 5-page. I think it wasn't a full paper we submitted to AOM. It was a 5-pager just around our ideas. And I vividly remember sitting in one of the hotel lobbies afterwards, the three of us, and dividing it up and saying, okay, there's 2 ideas here, if not more, but there's 2 we should focus on. One was around, coordination in organizations, which is something we're working on now. But the other one was, there's something just around the inherent, it was kind of the typology. And then so the typology was first. We said, okay, there's the typology here. We don't know what the research question is. We don't know how to frame this theoretically. And we don't know why organizational scholars will find this interesting, other than the fact that these technologies are kind of cool. So it was then, I remember us having conversations, and one day I was doing a review for another paper, had to read, as part of that review, I read Jennifer Howard Grenville and Anne Parmigiani's Annal's piece on routines. And I was like, hold on, this is where humans and technologies are working together. There's something here, and they're impacting how organizations are actually enacting certain processes. And I think I remember then we had a conversation probably 1.5 years in, where we can couch this in the routines literature. Now I'm going to be quiet and see if the other 2 want to chime in and see if there's anything else. But that was kind of our framing. And once we hit routines, then the ball started rolling and a manuscript came in.
That's great, because, there is that recombination aspect of creativity, right? And you got to have the different pieces to recombine before you can do the recombination. There's that wonderful YouTube video called "Everything's a Remix," and it makes this point very nicely. Yeah. So did David or Jen, did you want to chime in on this?
Well, I will, just because it's a fun story. And in my experience talking to other scholars, this is the question that I always ask. Tell me the backstory to your paper, because being in editorial roles, reviewer roles, author roles, there are really interesting backstories. And in a social science, this is the social part of it, the interactions of understanding. So, I think 3 of us had uniquely complementary skill sets and experiences before we engaged together on this research project. We all got along, but not so well that we didn't push and have friction in some of these meetings. And the whiteboard was full of different ideas. We did have different assumptions. And so getting to that typology, we had to work through a lot of hype that we were exposed to in reading and listening to popular press, our own experiences, some naysayers that other academics saying, hey, this is kind of a waste of your guys' time, when we really felt there was something fundamentally different here. And so just that positive yet friction-filled interactions. It took 1.5 years because we were reading books and we were discussing and really kind of pushing back and forth on what is this technology, where are some boundary conditions to it, and that took a lot of time to process. So the Alex is right. When he came into my office and the 3 of us were meeting on the whiteboard, and he said, hey, routines, and the pieces really did start falling together at that point, because we had that where this agency between the technology and human really does interact, and not in a phenomena only kind of example, but in an organizational theory relevant literature. And we weren't in search of the literature, but we were, as we kind of muddled through or recombined ideas, this one, it was a novel from our perspective, a novel consideration, because we weren't embedded in routines previously. And so then when we started getting into routines literature, in the review process, of course, we get scholars that are experts in routines.
Right.
And in that review and that revision effort to really fundamentally understand some of the assumptions and debates that were philosophical in nature regarding routines was, a fun experience for us, especially as the process was positive in the end, as you learn a tremendous amount of insight that I hadn't been exposed to in that great
more than you wanted to learn in the first place. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and so you have a great appreciation for different perspectives now.
Great. So yeah, and I think this is a challenge that I think a lot of people struggle with in developing research projects, probably throughout their careers, but especially at the earlier stages, is that it's kind of easy to identify interesting research topics, but it's rather harder to narrow it down to a particular research question. And it does require that kind of, framing and finding the right literature to fit it into in order to come up with that proper, research question. So I think that's great. So what made the project interesting enough for each of you to want to devote your time and effort to it?
That's a great question, particularly because I picked it up probably in my last year of the doctoral program. And, my dissertation was largely on, entrepreneurial resource mobilization, online community development. There were some similarities in just, the applications of new technologies, but by and large, it was very different. And that was my key focus. But there was something about this, particularly after that, the lecture we all attended, that just got the cogs turning for me. And for me, it truly was around blockchain. It was around the ability of a technology to govern an organization, a distributed organization, a decentralized organization, which I guess does get actually to more of my dissertation work on online communities. So I saw it as a tool to, be utilized in those settings, because one of the issues with online communities, well, how do you govern, 10,000 distributed actors? So I think that was what initially got me excited. But then also was why we had to eventually split out the two papers, because we realized, our focus on blockchain doesn't allow us to understand or appreciate these other technologies that are also being developed in tandem in organizations. So for me, the key interest early on was around blockchain and arresting technologies, particularly in governance. But then also as we continued talking, as the ideas grew, it became, this is exciting, this is new. I would love to compare and contrast these things more about what this means for organizations. So I guess that was, for me, why it was worth the time and resources at that juncture in the PhD program, when it may not have made a ton of sense to start a new project, but I decided to, and it obviously paid off, and it's a very exciting project to work on with a great co-author team.
Jen or David, did you guys have the same answer or different answers to that question?
Well, I have a slightly different answer. I think, so for me, I think in my second year, the end of my second year of the PhD program. And so for me, there was definitely more of a naivete around like sort of what makes good theory. And so it was a lot around the phenomenon. Like I come from an engineering background prior to doing this PhD. And so I think, I was really interested in the technology, and I was also, the more we got into it, like really interested in the variation in the technology and all of these things. And I found our conversations just so fascinating. And I, was learning so much like from David and Alex, that it was like really easy to keep going and to keep having these conversations. And every time we talked, I felt like there was new insights and sort of new things coming out. And so, yeah, it really started around the technology, but seeing, for me, like developing as a PhD student and developing sort of this firsthand, sort of hands-on knowledge of really how something can impact organizations and management theory at like this sort of bigger picture level was really an interesting experience.
I took it from a different spot, different stage of career. Most of my research had been related to resource-based logic in some capacity, and found that fascinating. But I got into this profession, and as probably most of us did, because we have some deep love of learning. And so here I found myself in a city, Seattle, that's largely technologically focused in its economy. Two bright, younger PhD students that had co-alignment, but uniquely different perspectives. And myself thinking, not a second act, that's kind of overly dramatic, but what more interesting things could be another 10-year push in research? And these things co-aligned in a wonderful way for me. I did have to play bad guy oftentimes in our discussions because they are so sharp, so insightful, that it seemed like at times I had to play, but we want to publish something. And that was hard because we had these really exciting, as you've heard through the conversations, really big, interesting ideas. So in addition to loving learning, I enjoy publishing work as well. So we had these really effective skill sets that helped. But the interest was learning something that's fascinating and something I truly believe will be central research for 10, 15 years, because the hype of these technologies and the reality of these technologies and what's been substantiated in an organizational lens for these technologies are wildly different. But as we work through this paper and other papers, the implications that these technologies have, creating communities, affecting stakeholders, I mean, go on and on. That's where my interest was really focused. Is this could be meaningful for a duration of time, and it's interesting to get involved in early thinking. And other people have talked about technology, not like we made it up, but thinking about the role of shared agency with technology is interesting.
I agree. Yeah, it makes sense. What were the biggest challenges that you faced in executing this project?
Okay, I'll take this one, guys. You guys can jump into. Okay, so we'll be specific, but not overly specific. So in the review process, so I'll jump to that stage.
Okay.
Alan's our associate editor, our action editor, and he steers us wonderfully through this process at AMR. That being said, his job was challenging because there are philosophical differences in people that are embedded in the routines area about what technology is, how they affect routines, what agency is. And this philosophical difference was, from me, and I'm not putting words in my co-author's mouth, was one of the most challenging revision processes that I've been involved with, and I've been involved with a few. And why it was challenging, because there's such, not just interest differences or argumentatively, you're not as compelling or as valid arguments, but philosophically going in different directions. And for us to thread the needle was challenging. And I give credit to Alan for actively being a guide as opposed to other interpretations of what the editorial role is, and helping us move through that. But that was challenging. It was challenging to the point of, I don't know if we can satisfy these different perspectives, but the point was we always face that different perspectives. But if we to satisfy this party, we could motivate such a response from this other party that they are going to, within their capacity, be very explicit to the editor that this is incorrect. And so that different philosophical positions was unique. And so kudos to Alan for, in my opinion, playing the editorial role that he was embedded in a way that was focused on advancing the literature in meaningful ways. And that's a tough thing to do.
Yeah, and it's good that you got that editorial guidance, because otherwise, as they say, when two dogs fight over a bone, the bone loses. So you don't want to be the bone there.
And Rich, you've been involved in, and different editors might see this different philosophically themselves, of more of a hands-off and satisfy the reviewers, and others take a different perspective. And I think Alan took a different perspective in this particular one, because we had we had reviewers that had different fundamental perspectives.
Yeah, I do think that's one of the things that you find at AMR is editors who get actively involved in the review process, don't just give you a boilerplate decision letter, are really actively involved in naming the issues and giving suggestions about how to navigate them. Yeah, that's one of the things I love about working with AMR. Okay. So how did the paper change between that first submission and the final article that got accepted for publication? Now I'm at a disadvantage here because I've only seen the final version, so I don't know how different it is from the original submission. So tell us a little bit about what changed along the way.
So great question, and this paper changed dramatically, but the most dramatic changes occurred before submission. From our,
maybe you should tell us about those changes first then.
Yeah, I mean, so at one point we had different terminology. We focused on the technologies much more centrally as the contribution, not embedding it in a conversation in the organizational literature very effectively. The routines change helped that. I think our outcomes. We looked at a significant amount. If we could have taken, and we did take pictures of our whiteboard, it'd be interesting to look at a collage of time lapse changes on that darn whiteboard, because our ideas advanced, but our outcomes of interest changed dramatically. And when we embedded in routines, of course, that required a different perspective as well. Jen, Alex, do you guys want to give some more juicy details on how radically this project changed before submission and then post initial submission to AMR?
Sure. So I think like the biggest change, in my opinion, actually is from like the working paper to before submission was actually adding the 2x2. So we wound up sending, like, kind of speaking to David's answer earlier about who's the audience, we actually sent this to friendly reviewers that were not necessarily experts in routines, that were not necessarily experts in technology, but who were very sort of experienced in developing theory and thinking about theory. And so they gave us a lot of great feedback. And despite the fact that they were from very different backgrounds themselves, gave pretty similar feedback. And they really helped us to clarify a lot of the language, I think, and to simplify and to really, we had that 2x2 sort of in the text, right, in our thinking, but we didn't have it as a figure. And I think they really helped push us to just that next level of clarity. And that was done sort of in that last few months right before we submitted it. And I think that helped a lot.
And I can also chime in here, and I am going to disclose that I'm at a bit of an unfair advantage here because I just opened up a version of the paper from April of 2019. So I can actually tell you two things that changed with a bit more precision than I can actually have off top of mind. So one thing we did, and I think this actually, in my experience of writing theory papers, still when I have published with, I have one other in the review process now, I've worked on a couple, is that the first round of propositions in your early drafts often end up higher up in the paper in the theoretical overview. And that's something that happened for us. So I'm looking at it now, and we initially had a typology of technologies, but it wasn't a typology of conjoined agency. And actually that was something that was very key for us. So we actually, in the first iteration of the paper, we had to, describe all these technologies, went really in depth on the tech. And then proposition 1 was, in the presence of these agentic technologies, conjoined agency exists in organizations. And then the first set of propositions, and this is why routines were so key, was just around this concept of a theory of conjoined agency, but it wasn't embedded in any existing body of literature. That's why routines were so central. It was kind of just this floating idea of conjoined agency. It's important, it exists. And I think it was then through that next round of iteration where we bumped up conjoined agency. It's like, no, we don't need to actually make propositions around this. This is what we're saying exists. This is, based on other literatures and, allied fields. If you look at our citations, some of them were from computer science and engineering that just show that, these technologies are being utilized in organizations. And then that's what allowed us to flow into the conversation around routines. And then also another thing we added later on was going back essentially and say, well, how does, bounded rationality influence here? How is myopic search impacted here? And it was that technology impacts humans' ability to search, or the technology is searching itself. And then also the bounded rationality of humans is affected when different technologies are in play. And that was kind of the logic for our propositions themselves as they fell into the routines literature.
Great. Okay, well, one last question for you, but it's when I say one last question, it's actually a 5-part question. So,
all right.
So the question is, what impact do you hope that this paper will have in the future? So the 5 parts are, in terms of its influence on future theory, future empirical research, future practice, future pedagogy, future policy, right? Those are the 5 kind of outcomes I could think of that might impact outcomes that I could think of that might happen. So what impact do you hope paper will have in any of those 5 areas?
I'll take a shot.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, David. No, okay, David, go ahead. No, all you.
I think it back to the 3 audience I'm talking about, a person involved and with different levels of exposure to technology, people embedded in routines, and then people that are engaged in this really interesting thing is how are organizations changing? And in this pandemic of the last year, we've seen that organizations with technology can change rapidly and still remain effective, and in some cases become more effective, in some cases less. And so I would hope that this paper is being read by PhD students thinking to themselves, how can we reimagine organizations? Jen, her dissertation on organizations that don't remain in a co-located traditional sense is one slice of reimagining that we see actually occurring in real life. But the role of these technologies, not just Zoom, which allows some mediated communication, but to replace and change interdependencies and a slew of interesting organizationally focused factors. So I think for me, my hope more than anything else is it really drives that next research question. And it can be conceptual, it can be empirical. Empirical is gonna be hard, but with case-based inductive research and related types of research, that investigation can occur. I think least important to me, at least, is the policy change, because I think there's gonna be a lot more needed research to inform policy. And we see this occurring where you have different discussions occurring in the US Congress and in Europe about how to regulate big tech. Issues around misinformation. And these technologies will play a really important role. I hope in that realm that this idea of conjoined or human and arresting or blockchain with versions of AI can be combined to strengths and weaknesses playing off each other. But that's where I think a significant amount more research is necessary, because when I read and continue to read across different writers, the separation between substantiated versus hype is so dramatic that I'd hate to quickly assume that this type of technology is better, or it might have unintended consequences that we are fully unaware of. So first is that PhD student, least in my opinion, because we need more information and more evidence, is policy. Jen, Alex?
Yes, I can hop in here for a second. So I think empirically is where I'm most intrigued moving forward, is how can things be tested empirically or qualitatively inducted? And I think that's where I fall in this, 2 projects, one with this co-author team, another one is I'm collecting data on now, is, what are the coordination mechanisms that are enabled to be emerge from using blockchain in organizations? So that's one question that, we're looking at. Another one is the intersection of these technologies. So we talk about in the paper very specifically about conjoined agency with human and technology. But if you get into the discussion section, if I'm not mistaken, there's a couple sentences there around what about when technology works with technology. And I've been collecting some data on distributed energy grids, which are using AI alongside blockchain. So you have this automating technology and this arresting technology, and how are they being utilized in tandem with one another? What does that form of conjoined agency look like? Are there different ways in which maybe arresting technologies are constraining automating technologies, or are automating technologies actually the consensus function that's creating these arresting technologies? So we're kind of looking, temporally how these different technologies are A, emerging and being developed in organizations, and B, working alongside each other. And both of those, multi-case qualitative inductive studies. Just to David's point, I think it is hard to get large sample data right now to then do, deductive research on. We also don't necessarily know what are those hypotheses at this point. So I do think, some inductive, grounded, qualitative work. This area is rife for those kind of studies. The other question, I think the other area you talked about was pedagogy. And I don't necessarily know if I'm developing, an agentic tech or a conjoined agency class at this point in time. I do see, obviously there being room for at least a week in an org theory seminar around conjoined agency, or, more particularly technology in organizations, contemporary tech in organizations, emerging tech in organizations. And you're seeing a lot of calls for those kinds of studies right now. I think, org science is a special issue coming out on that very topic. But I think in my own classes, which are normally entrepreneurship, tech innovation, a lot of it's around, pushing students, if you think about a business model design, like when they put forth their key activities, how do you integrate these technologies to develop a competitive advantage or to deliver on your value proposition? If you're trying to, I had one group this past year that was, trying to develop a tool to actually prevent disinformation from media sources. And I was like, well, how could you use blockchain to do that? Or how could you use AI to do that? And then actually, putting the burden on them to go out and do research and then try to develop, their startup's business model utilizing these technologies. That's kind of where I've been integrating it. Also have a couple of cases. So even when I'm teaching resource mobilization, or if I'm teaching business model design, I've been increasingly trying to get new cases where the business model is designed around AI or blockchain. So even if the case itself isn't about, blockchain or AI, it's about, a core, resource mobilization. How do you acquire resources? I'll oftentimes use a venture that has those technologies embedded in its business model, so they're at least being exposed to them and thinking about them. So that's been a conscious decision I've made in my case selection over the last 2 years in particular.
Right. Okay. Jen, what do you think about the potential future impact of the paper?
Yeah, I think for me, the impact really comes from the typology and from this idea that, there's a lot of variance in the technologies that are out there that organizations are using, and the importance of that variance, right? And so I think it's really important that this paper starts with the idea of assisting technologies and things that we're all familiar with, to say that this isn't a huge departure from the past, right? This is something that is very present today. And we start to define these different categories, these different types. I think there's a lot more work that can be done there, and the impact they have. I think, this crosses over all those categories that you mentioned. I think a lot about sort of what's happening in the world today with AI, with machine learning, and the inequalities and the injustices that are happening, right? So if we can get to a point where we're thinking more nuanced about technology and about the impact that it's having, and not just creating blanket policies or blanket ways of thinking about this, we can actually get to a place where, hopefully we can be able to, utilize the good aspects and also recognize and have tough conversations around sort of some of the more negative aspects and what we're not understanding yet, and where the open questions are, and do more research around those areas. And so I think for me, the big impact is really just starting to think about technologies as different types, and adding more, like, I think this adds a little nuance, and just to continue that path of sort of breaking up the different types of technology that exist, and how they're impacting both organizations and society on a larger scale.
Well, great. I'm out of questions. So it's been great talking with you. And, again, to the Origin series audience, I really strongly recommend this paper. It's an excellent paper. And thank you for joining this episode of the Origin series.
All righty, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
My pleasure.
Thanks for having us, Rich. Thank you.